Good morning, dear students. This lecture is for the students of English Honours of Semester 4. In this lecture, I am going to talk about the critics and criticisms of The Way of the World by Congreve. Now, before moving on to the critics, just let us have a brief overview of the influences on Congreve. According to Congreve, Terence is the most correct writer of the world. Congreve, in The Way of the World, followed the comic mode of Plautus and Terence. Their comedies were concerned primarily with the exposure of social aberrance and were satirical in tone. Restoration comedy is concerned with the aberrations of a particular section of the society, and this provides us a picture of the contemporary society. An important task of the dramatist is to distinguish between false manners and true manners, false wit from true wit, and very often this restoration comedy has been described as artificial comedy. Now, in this context of true wit and false wit, true intellect and a kind of pseudo-intellect, we cannot ignore the influence of Molière. So, Moliere's famous work, Misanthrope, also was an important influence on Congreve. Apart from Moliere, Plautus and Terence, we cannot ignore the influence of Ben Jonson. Though there are much departures from Johnsonian comedies, while Johnsonian comedies focused mostly on the individual aberrance, the individual humors, here the focus is on a particular group, and here it is the upper middle class or the aristocratic section of the society, the men and women of the aristocratic society. Now, in the context of this artificial comedy, we cannot ignore the contemporary philosophical view of that time. Now, people during that time were mostly concerned with the social manners, social proprieties. They gradually deviated from what is normal and what is natural. They wanted to put on false appearances, masking their identities for their own material gain. And the influence of the Hobbesian philosophy and the influence of John Locke can also be found in this play. The people at this time tried to be much more concerned with their material gain. And here in this play, the focus mostly is on marriage, sex and marriage, and how marriage was corrupted by a kind of materialistic demands. Here, before going to those other thematic issues, just I would like to refer to a very important event, that is the publication of Jeremy Collier's short view of the immorality and profaneness of the English stage that was published in 1698, where Jeremy Collier attacked the Restoration comedy on the ground of its obscenity and immorality. This charge of immorality was constantly counterattacked, and this play, The Way of the World, was written 2 years after, definitely as a reply to this charge of immorality. But whatever the situation may be, Restoration comedy failed to cater to the needs of the people and the society, and therefore the place was taken by sentimentalism or the sentimental comedy, which we all know. Now, coming to the critics after Jeremy Collier, I would like to focus on Charles Lamb, the romantic criticism. So Charles Lamb tried to attack this charge of, he tried to raise his voice against this charge of immorality, and he is of the view that Restoration comedy takes us to a world of imagination. Okay, a world which is imaginary, which is not immoral, but a world that is unmoral. Thus, he is trying to focus on the escapist nature of these comedies, and he's of the view that there is this aura of imagination associated with these comedies. In It was Bonamy Dobree who, in his very famous book Restoration Comedy, raises his arguments against the charge of impurity or immorality of the Restoration Comedy. He considers that these comedies are not artificial but presents an accurate picture of the society, the style, the living habits, the men and women of the time, the 17th century manners and the way of life. The spirit of rationalism which is presented in these comedies can well be related to the Hobbesian view of the material nature of the universe, where the focus was more on rational analysis, empiricism, and the assessment of man. The concept of decorum, all these philosophical traits can also be traced in the way of the world. Bonamy Dobree, in his book Restoration Comedy, refers to this age as, I quote, an age of inquiry and curiosity, in which criticism became active for the first time. So this is very significant. Here, the Restoration playwrights, my focus is on Congreve, it was not for them to encourage this kind of immorality, rather they wanted to represent a mirror of the time, and their perspective was to point out the common errors of life through satire and through their criticism of the social conventions and the way of the life. This spirit of rationality and the material nature of the universe actually led to a kind of representation of the material needs that were in vogue among the people during the time. Apart from this view that these plays are not artificial, they focused the contemporary issues, they are a mirror of the society, Bonamy Dobree also focused on sex antagonism, where men and women wanted to establish their identity, their independence without much consideration for the opposite sex. Their inclination was to maintain an aura of responsibility, and this was mostly derived from a kind of appearance, a masked appearance that actually hid their real identity. Very often we find the characters exploiting others for their own material profit, for their own gain. The institution of marriage was based on material demands and to create this aura of respectability. Sex and love, these two concepts became quite separated from each other in the context of marriage. The marriages which we find in these Restoration comedies were mostly a marriage of individual gain, where we find that love is only there for the society. Most marriages here are loveless marriages, and therefore it culminates in disaster and breakups. Finally, after Dobree's criticism, which actually focused that Restoration comedies represent a mirror of the times, represent a picture of the society, Restoration comedy to a certain extent was able to come out of the stigma of immorality. Next, we move on to L.C. Knight's essay. The title of the essay is Restoration Comedy, the Reality and the Myth, which is included in his explorations. L.C. Knight is totally changing the order of criticism about these Restoration comedies. Here, he is trying to point out that the issue is not immorality, but the focus is on the insipidity. These plays are insipid, that means without any depth, without any critical innovations, okay, and therefore these are tasteless, insipid. I just quote, the criticism that defenders of restoration comedy need to answer is not that the comedies are immoral, but that they are trivial, gross, and dull. So here Elsie Knights is deviating from Bonamy Dobree, and he is again pointing out that these plays are artificial, very much artificial, because they are not adequate. They are not a mirror of the society. They are not a representation of the time, and it does not show a frank attitude to sex. So there is no such query of immorality or obscenity, and no realization, no rationalization of sex either. But the triviality and the boredom represents the boredom of its times. He also criticizes the moral approach of the play, and he says that definitely these moral issues should be taken into consideration, but it should be valid only in the long run. So here we find that each of the critics are deviating from each other. Now, another perspective that which we are going to discuss today is the political stance of the play, which has very often been overlooked. So, Congreve can very often be judged as a political dramatist, but this is overlooked. We are mostly concerned with the themes, with the immorality, but we don't focus on the political issues which are prevalent here. Now, let's go back to the social background. The Restoration period, when Charles II was restored to the throne of England. So here we find there is a kind of constant contrast between absolute authority, which was the doctrine of the monarchy, and the parliamentarianism. And these two political perspectives are reflected in the two major characters of the play, Mirabell and Mr. Fainall. So, just I would like to focus on few features of the time. This play hints at the collapse of the feudal order and the rise of the middle class, where relationships mostly were based on law and money. This law and money were the 2 points that asserted power, the two institutions of power in the society, the Restoration period. Now, during this time, the decorum of a gentleman depended in large measure on having his emotions under proper control, and therefore Mirabell is appreciated. We find that Mirabell is also a spendthrift. Mirabell also drinks, just participates in the gossips, but there is a control of his emotion. He strongly opposes when women are criticized. He strongly opposes when one tries to take advantage of the other. But this should be taken into consideration that Mirabell knows how to balance his emotions and keep it under control, and this is a primary feature of the gentleman during the time. The new men of the new era, they should be those men who have self-imposition and a control over their self-identity. So Mirabell and Fainall stand as a contrast to each other. Mirabell exhibits this careful discipline of his emotions, and therefore we find that Mirabell finally is liked by everybody, whereas Fainall's evil intentions and his evil plans, everything comes to the limelight. Now, Fainall and Mirabell, they represent these two different orders. The two men definitely represent the conflicting political ideas. The absolute authority of the Stuarts in contrast to the parliamentary rule. And therefore, we find that the king, the monarchy, with its rule, with its licentious way of living, definitely leaves an imprint here. I would like to refer to the critic Richard Braveman, and his work is Cultural Readings of Restoration and 18th Century Theatre. In this work, Richard Braveman views that the two men, Mirabell and Fainall, represent these conflicting political ideals. Fainall is the person who executes the arbitrary power of the stewards while he is exercising his libertine will, and he is exercising his personal will at the cost of others also, where others suffer for his own materialistic needs. While Mirabell, the new man of the new age, is having a control over his emotions, and finally he thinks of others too. Now Fainall is more concerned about his personal will, the desire to control others by the exercise of his will. In line with Hobbes' Leviathan, Fainall's egotistical instinct drives him to exploit others for his own material gain. The society was considered to be dominated by two institutions during that time, as I told you before also, wealth and law. Money and property was inherited in this genteel society, and one did not have to work in order to acquire wealth, and wealth was mostly inherited from the ancestors. And so the young men, the so-called gentlemen of the time, they had the time to spend their time in these gossips, in the chocolate houses, and the women too. We should also focus on the lives of the contemporary aristocratic women. So, on one hand, definitely we laugh at Lady Wishfort, how she is trying to carry on her makeover pretensions and trying to express her desire before men, always ready to hunt for a man and to be in bed with him. But we cannot overlook the helplessness of these women, that they had no other option. In this context, we may also refer to Mary Wollstonecraft's Vindication of the Rights of Women, where Mary Wollstonecraft is also speaking about that women had no other option but to beautify themselves, to engage themselves in trivial household work. It was considered that they did not have any intellectual power to take part in discussions in political affairs and other important issues. So in this respect, we see that these aristocratic women had no other option but, in order to seek their identity, or in order to gain this sort of pseudo respectability, they had to hunt for a rich suitor or a rich partner with whom they can get settled, and at the same time their wealth would also be transferred to the suitor. And therefore these marriages were mostly loveless marriages based on a sort of contract and with a series of provisos, where there was no love. Love was there only in appearances before the common people, but mostly these were all loveless marriages, and sex also existed outside this order of marriage in illicit love relationships, and husband and wife mutually deceiving each other, and so on. These were the conventions. In the book A New View of Congreve's Way of the World in 1958, Miriam Musky describes it as a legal conflict. Okay, the legacy conflict. Miriam Musky uses the term legacy conflict, where she speaks of the three possessors of the wealth. Who are the three possessors? Lady Wishfort, Mrs. Fainall, and Millamant. But we find that it is only Lady Wishfort who is having the entire wealth under her control. So money becomes an effective instrument of power only if it is carefully protected and judicially handled, and Lady Wishford definitely fails to do that, and therefore very easily she is trapped, not because of her own faults only, but also because of the social conventions, her desire to cope up with the social manners and earn a sort of respectability. Another important feature is that parliamentary power rests on the authority of the legal will. So, power very much was concerned with this legal will, and therefore whenever this crisis appears, we find that it is the legal document which is taken into consideration. Wishford's control over Millamant and Phenol was definitely a legal control. She was the legal guardian of them. And we find that even the contract of marriage between Mirabell and Millamant was also a sort of legal consent. So regarding marriage also we have this concept of legality. And this consent of marriage was required. The consent of Wishford was required in order to get Millament's share. A very important symbol here in the play is the black box. I hope you remember in Act 5 we have the reference to the black box, which is a representative of the legal system and that functions as a sort of control over villainy and evil motives and the materialism of Mr. Phenol and Maru. Gradually, we see that this play does not end with a sort of happy marriage. And here we see Mr. Phenol and Mrs. Phenol. They had to stay together in spite of their lovelessness and hatred for each other. But we find that Millamant and Mirabell, they are married, and this is just the marriage of true minds. Okay, a marriage of two intellects, two adult men and women who not only are concerned about the present material gain, but are more concerned about the future, how to get a secure future. And there we find in the proviso scene, which we will discuss in the second part of the lecture, that how their intellect actually drives them into a sort of contract which is essential in order to make a marriage a lovable and an everlasting one, a contrast to the contemporary marriages that were based on a kind of understanding and a kind of material fulfillment. And here, as I was talking about the conclusion, the comedy does not focus on the happy marriage of Mirabell and Millamant and they are living happily ever after. But it is on the genuinity on Mirabell, who is transferring the deed of trust to Mrs. Phenol, the friend. And we also note the dedication of Mrs. Phenol, who also loves Mirabell but is ready to sacrifice her love for the happiness of Mirabell and Millamant. And we cannot overlook the faith and the sincerity of Mirabell, who also gives back his friend the due property. And therefore this deed of trust is again very significant. So we have discussed 4 to 5 critics, and where each critic is talking about different perspectives. We have Charles Lamb with the romantic perspectives, focusing on this kind of imaginative perspective or the imaginative tendency of the Restoration playwrights. As a contrast, we have Bonamy Dobree, who is focusing on or who is raising his voice against the allegation of immorality and trying to say that the Restoration comedy of manners provides a genuine picture of the society and these are not artificial. We have Elsie Nice, who says that these plays are trivial and gross. And again we have Miriam Musky, who speaks of the legacy conflict, where we find the focus is on law, marriage, sex, money, the major themes of the play. In the next lecture, I will talk of the basic themes and the proviso scene, the theme of money and marriage and the proviso scene. Thank you.